So I want to jump to the next piece, which is the 4 abilities of equity literacy. I started talking about this a little bit earlier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but when I work with schools, I usually say that more than cultural competence, more than cultural proficiency, what we really need is equity literacy. We need to strengthen our literacy around equity, and that revolves around these 4 skills. The first is the ability to recognize inequity. Can I recognize it? If it's right in front of me, can I recognize it? And that's why so often the exercises I do are really about how can I practice learning how to recognize inequity? If you picked up a children's book and there were subtle forms of ableism in it, would you recognize that? Would you be able to recognize that? I'll give you some other examples on the next slide. The second is the ability to respond to inequity. This is about being reactive. In the moment, something happens. Let's say a student uses a homophobic slur in the classroom. Do I know how to respond to that without just saying, we don't use that language? Because for students who are targets of that, that's really not an adequate response to something like that, right? Or let's say, I know in a lot of parts of Canada where I've worked, one thing that's becoming popular and also quite popular in the United States are these online platforms for communicating with parents. So we'll post homework assignments on there, we'll post grades on there, everything gets posted on this online thing. And so let's say I'm in a meeting and somebody says, oh, we're going to go to this online platform for communicating with parents. First, do I recognize what those actually do, which is they improve access to the families who already have the most access, but they actually might limit the access of the families who already have the least amount of access. So how do I access that if I don't have the technology to access that? You've actually made this less accessible to me, not more accessible to me, right? So what I recognize that. I'll give you an example of something that I recently responded to that I'd probably seen this 1,000 times and I hadn't recognized it, but I was going into a school in, I don't know if any of you saw this, but there was this high school in the US where there was this viral photo of like 50 young men from this high school standing on risers and doing a Nazi salute. Anybody see that come across your social media? I'm doing some work with that high school right now. It's funny because people see that photo and they think, oh, well, everyone just must be running around that school doing Nazi salutes. But the truth is there's nothing going on in that school that's not also going on in your school. It's just that this one terrible moment was caught on a photograph, and so now people think everything's awful there. Anyway, so I'm walking into this high school, and right outside the high school there's a yard sign, you know, those things you stick in the grass. And on the yard sign is this thing, this announcement that remember to bring money for your yearbook by Friday because the early bird rate ends on Friday. Well, I've walked by signs like that 1,000 times and it just never occurred to me until I walk into that high school, I see that sign and I say, wait a second. What's that? What that is actually guaranteeing is that the families with the least amount of money are going to end up paying the most for that yearbook. And the families with the most money are going to pay the least amount for that yearbook. That is ass backward when it comes to equity. That makes no sense. But there's stuff like that in schools all the time. But the point of this story is not really that. The point of the story is if I don't know how to recognize that, if I can't recognize that right in front of me, then I would not have been able to address that as an equity issue in the school. So I have to constantly learn how to recognize these things happening. The third is the ability to redress. Respond is important, but it's not enough. Respond is what I do reactively. This pops up, respond to that reactively. This pops up, respond to that reactively. Redress is more proactive. Again, if you're working in a school, racism is operating in that school all the time. Sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, all of that stuff is operating all the time. So we shouldn't be waiting for instances of it to pop up. We should be proactively addressing it. Proactively addressing it. It shouldn't take students complaining that they're not reflected in the curriculum for us to transform the curriculum. It's just being good educators to transform the curriculum, right? So redress. The other part of redress is I can't just respond to little things that pop up. I have to take a step back and say, let's say there's a, let's go back to this policy about that online forum for communicating with parents. Part of the question responding is, okay, well, how do we respond to the fact right now that we might have just created less access to our most economically marginalized families? The second question, from an equity literacy point of view, is what is it about the institutional culture and leadership here that landed us in this bad decision to begin with? Because if we don't address that, we're going to be reacting to bad, inequitable decisions over and over and over. Right? So redress is being able to take a step back. And I can think about this even in the context of my own classroom. What is the network of things that are going on here? What is the whole list of things that I do that might provide advantage to some students and disadvantage to other students? To proactively look at that and address it and have the humility to critically analyze it. Then finally, sustain equity. Raise your hand if you have ever challenged a person or an institution on an equity issue, and as a result of that, somebody didn't like you. Yes. We need a club. Can we start a club where the unlikables, we're just the unlikable club. We love each other, but everyone else doesn't like us. This is inevitable. This is inevitable. If we're doing this right, people are going to complain. The people who are going to complain are the people who have a sense of entitlement to having more access and opportunity than everyone else. If they're not complaining, if they don't feel threatened, then we're not doing equity right. Some percentage of those people are going to be right on board with this. Yes, I'm on board with it. Let's redistribute the access and the opportunity. Some percentage of them, it doesn't matter how nice of a bow we tie on it, they are not going to like the progress. If there aren't people who feel threatened by what we're doing, then we're not doing equity hard enough. We're not doing equity hard enough. And we have to learn how to see that backlash as especially talking to leaders here, because often what I see is that you have people who don't have institutional power are the ones who keep bringing this stuff up and keep getting beaten back for bringing it up, right? So especially if you have a positional leadership in an institution. Here's the reality in my experience working in schools. In a lot of schools I work in, I don't know if this is true of any schools that y'all are working in. A lot of schools that I work in, the people who are the most outspoken about equity and justice often are the ones burning out. Really, if we're doing equity right, the people who are dragging their heels the most around equity and justice should be the ones burning out. Because they should be the ones who feel like, I don't feel like I'm connected to this institution. I feel like I'm an outsider here. But usually it's the loudest voices for equity and justice who feel like an outsider. If you're a leader and that's happening in your school, you are failing as a leader. That's your responsibility as a leader. Your responsibility as a leader is to put the people most committed to this at the center of the institutional culture. And the people who are not engaged in it, I'm not saying they're all horrible people, some of them are, but I'm not saying they all are. They should feel like they don't belong in your institution. That should be, I either have to get on board with this or I need to find a different place to work. They should feel like that, not the people committed to racial justice.